If you've been reading along in the book, then you know that you can't read this chapter very long until you begin to thinking about the fanaticism that is loose in our world religiously. The declaration that he's dealing with is the fact that we oftentimes see religion doing more injustice than it does justice. He certainly speaks to the issue of what religion means and how we can wrap ourselves around it, but I wasn't 10 minutes into the chapter, probably more like 5, when I kept thinking of a name, and I don't like to mention his name much, but I think he is certainly the poster child for how religion can in fact go wrong and how it can be wrapped in injustice. Bin Laden was something of a poet. He actually wrote, "Let my grave be an eagle's belly, its resting place in the sky's atmosphere amongst perched eagles." His grave is somewhere at the bottom of the Arabian Sea. And as Peter Bergen wrote in Time magazine, if there is poetry in Bin Laden's end, it is the poetry of justice. I have, as you know, thrown myself in the midst of analyzing history. When I go back into this man's life, he was born in 1957 in Saudi Arabia, 7th son and 17th son of 54 children and 22 wives. Now, that alone tells you a lot right there. I mean, can you imagine that? His father was Mohammed bin Laden, and he was made a fortune in commercial construction. And today, his company is somewhere around worth $5 billion. His father died in a plane crash when bin Laden was 10 years old. He married his first cousin when he was 17 and she was 13. Reportedly, he at last, before he died, had 23 children and 5 wives. He studied business in a university, and the influence of 2 men played significantly in his life. I think I might be able to pronounce their names. Abdullah Azzam is an Islamic scholar who taught, and obviously bin Laden believed, that the goal was to unite a pure Islamic state through holy war with the West. The other influence was a man who was heavily involved in the assassination of Anwar Sadat. He was an Egypt eye surgeon by the name of Ayman al-Zawahiri. The key to understanding all of this man, this wretched man that he was, actions, was the utter conviction that he had to be an instrument of what he considered to be God's will, and that he was a zealot. As a teenager, he was had a soccer-playing buddy who remembered him as a man who prayed 7 times a day, which was 2 more than was expected, and he fasted 2 times a week in imitation of the Prophet Muhammad. His religious zeal was colored by the fact that his family had, in fact, garnered this vast fortune and was the principal contractor for renovating the holy sites of Mecca and Medina, which begin to connect the dots about how he felt about holiness. Of course, his destiny would forever change in 1979 when the Afghan war against the Soviet invasion prompted him to confront the Soviets with a small group of Arabs who would later become the nucleus of a group that we now call the Al-Qaeda, which he founded in 1988. The purpose of this group was to take jihad, or war against unbelievers, to other parts of the globe. One final thing about him: his best friend and later brother-in-law, Jamal Khalifa, told Peter Bergen that bin Laden was driven not only by a desire to implement what he saw as God's will, but also of a fear of divine punishment. I tell you that story not because I want to talk about him at all, but I do want to be a person of history. And if there is any moral to the story, it is this: be careful how you discern God's will and how you manage your fears. Because if you don't, your religion will go wrong, really, really wrong. Our world is a canvas of historical moments when even Christianity has gone awry. Wayne Oates, in his classic book, When Religion Gets Sick, he recognizes from all corners that religion can be a foul faith at times. He mentions the suicide bombers and their promised eternal rewards. He mentions people at war who want to reoccupy an old holy land because they want to be obedient to God. And then there are priests and even preachers, yes, who engage in sins that ruin their lives and ruin those around them. So let me give you a basic definition of religion. It should be on the board above you. Religion is defined as the practice of religious beliefs and observance of one's faith. It's just a rudimentary frame out of which you live your life. And we've talked long and hard about the distinctions between religion and relationship. But let me give you a couple statistics. A Pew Forum on religion and public life recently said that religion influence in American life has dropped to pre-September 11th levels. Is that a surprise to a whole lot of people? Probably not. But it says that less than 50% say that belief in God is necessary to be a moral person, and that more than 75% say that many religions can lead to eternal life, and that nearly 50% of highly committed Christians agree with the previous statement. So you can see that we have had in our world what I would call, what others have called, and I certainly agree with, the Oprahfication of religion in our world. The Oprahfication, and you know I've spoken about Dear Oprah on occasion, and that is that the assumption that all truth is based upon human experience and feelings and emotion. And anytime, let me just put an exclamation point there, anytime you reduce your religious experience just to those things, watch out. As opposed to other things like the claim of religious doctrine or transcendent faith or cultural traditions. There is much more to be had than just your emotions. So the point is that the important thing about a religion is how it makes us feel, not whether it's true. And that is evident all around us. And for those of us who don't adhere to that, we are perceived oftentimes as intolerant. So let's get more specific. If you go to Matthew 23, you will find what Max Lucado calls the midway religion of the New Testament church. Chapter 23 is absolutely filled with Jesus' encounter with religion of his day. And for those of you who think, and if you've read your chapter of the book this week, if you think that Jesus in fact was a part of the religious part of his segment of his time, then you haven't read the New Testament. Jesus criticizes religion like no other person. Jesus denounced the Pharisees for their abuse of spiritual authority over and over again. And someone has said, none are so unholy as those whose hands are cauterized. That's an interesting word. It means when you burn something to prevent the infection. None are so unholy as those hands who are cauterized with holy things. What's he saying? He's saying that sacred things can become profane things by becoming simply matters of a job that we do. And that speaks obviously to those of us who are called into this profession that I'm in, into this calling that I'm in. I guess the point I want to raise high is that there is an expectation within the walls of this church, and hopefully that extend far beyond it. There is an expectation of spiritual transformation. That religion is not a framework out of which we live our system of ought and to-dos, but rather our faith is built on a relationship that does expect us to walk with Christ in a way that brings spiritual formation in my life. So let's talk about it. First of all, there is the perennial religious problem. It's the perennial religious problem. Jesus says in verse 3 of chapter 23 of Matthew, "So practice and observe whatever they tell you, but not what they do, for they teach, but do not practice." The real scary part of this is that when believers say things like this, we are only human, to err is human. Well, Christians aren't perfect, we're just forgiven. And as much as there is truth to a little bit of both of those statements, I want to scream when I hear them, because they don't sound like a statement as much as an excuse to forget about the spiritual transformation part. And of course, if you want to know anything about spiritual transformation, pick up almost anything that the late Dallas Willard has written. He was a man that lived his life in the midst of this secular world. He taught philosophy at the University of Southern California, and it was there that he lived out his faith in real terms. This issue of hypocrisy is really a serious problem. Recently, there was a book written entitled Unchristian, and it was based on the research of a study that said 85% of unchurched young adults believe Christians to be hypocrites. And 47 of young adults inside the church say the same thing. Now, let me first say that just because somebody says something is hypocritical does not mean that it is not the truth. Let me give you an example of that. Stephen Nordby writes, at a recent annual meeting of the American Heart Association in Atlanta, Georgia, 300,000 doctors and researchers came together to discuss the importance of low-fat diets in keeping our hearts healthy. He says during the meal times, however, they consumed fat-filled fast food, bacon cheeseburgers, chili fries at the same artery-clogging high rate as people who go to the other conventions. One cardiologist, as a matter of fact, was asked, aren't you concerned that your bad eating habits will be a bad example? To which he replied, not me, I took off my name tag before I came in here. Now, what is wrong with that picture? There is no taking off your name tag as a Christian, even though the world is going to push us to do that. John Ortberg introduced me to a book this week called The Encyclopedia of Ethics. Now, when I saw that, I said, oh my gosh, that sounds like a boring reading. But in there is an article by a scholar by the name of Eva Kate. She takes the word hypocrite, hypocrites, and she talks about how we got that word. It came from a drama. You know, if you were a hypocrite, you were on the stage in Plato and Aristotle's time, and you wore a mask. And back then, it didn't have necessarily the negative connotation that we think of it today. But it is bad nonetheless. But this is where it gets interesting. I did not know this. He calls upon a theater that was built in the first century, and the day, one of the great theaters of the day, Sepphoris. And I think you'll see a picture of it here in just a moment. And it is an amazing thing because they've uncovered it recently. And in that uncovering of that, you can see how vast it is. It seated 3,000 to 4,000 people, I think. But guess what little town was really close to Sepphoris? Little town by the name of Nazareth. There are many who believe, and matter of fact, as I did some research, most scholars will actually say it is a probability that craftsmen from Nazareth, like maybe a Joseph and his son Jesus, may well have in fact worked on this project. And so Jesus would have had a frontline picture of this whole issue of hypocrite and what it might mean. Well, what I found out that I did not know was that this is amazing in that it's one of the words that Jesus used over and over again. Of the 17 times the word hypocrite is used in the New Testament, guess who uses it? Not most of the time, every time. Jesus. Every time the word is used in the Bible, in the New Testament, it's used by Jesus. So in reality, Jesus kind of set into place our understanding of what a hypocrite really is. And what hit me about it was, it's not just about not measuring up. It is to pointedly deceive. It's not just that I don't measure up to everything that I seek to measure up to. It is that I want to deceive you into believing that it's not true. And boy, did my mind go to work on that one. Dallas Willard says, it is clear from the literary records that it was Jesus alone who brought this term hypocrisy and the corresponding character into the moral record of the Western world. It is ironic that even when we criticize the church for producing hypocrites, that we pay tribute to the man, Jesus, whose teaching gave us the picture of hypocrisy that shapes our moral understanding 2,000 years plus later. So when we are hypocrites, this is what we're saying. Not only do I not live up to the standard, but I spend my time, I manage my deception. I deceive you to get what I want to get. I hide my secret. I pretend behind a polite smile. I'm portraying myself as loving when inside I am full of judgment. I like to give the impression that I'm bravely committed to God when I am not, and I may even convince myself that I'm devout or loving, but I may be a hypocrite. And then I read the case of Darren Sharper. Now, I'm a sports fan of sorts. I know, or I watched Darren Sharper play, and he was a phenomenal athlete. You'll see his picture there. And if you don't know his story, then you probably need to know a little bit about it. A 5-time All-Pro safety for the Packers, the Vikings, and the Saints. He was a part of the Saints when they won the Super Bowl. Since he's retired, and once wrote about his daughter, Amara, that, quote, she makes me mindful of how women are treated. Now, I'm not going to have him guilty in a court of law, but it's hard not to look at what is going on with his life. He is accused of raping 9 women in 6 separate incidents after putting something in their drinks. Yes, and that means more than one of them in a night. The man who had a stand-up image and even was a broadcaster for the NFL has taken a beating as his stories have suddenly become rampant, like skipping out on a $700 dinner and drinks bill, like finding out that what he had been denying for years about having an illegitimate second child is in fact true. He does have a second child. As I read the story and the sadness that wrapped around it, we all have to answer this question. Did I live up to the standard that I set for myself and that God set for me? And if I did not, did I deceive those around me into thinking that I was? The perennial religious problem. Secondly, there is the recurring contradiction. The sin that Jesus accused the Pharisees of was allowing their actions to contradict everything about their lives. Remember the book Into Thin Air? John Krakauer talks about these climbers who were climbing an expedition on the Mount Everest in the spring of 1996. And the story of Andy Harris. If you know this story, it's just creepy. But he lost his life. He died there. But what was odd about it, as they analyzed the story, was that he had in his supply tank all the oxygen he needed in order to live. So what happened? His mind got so disoriented that though he was surrounded by the restoring supply of air that he needed, he continued to communicate with those around him that he did not have what he needed, and he in fact died. The very thing that he held in his hands was absent in his brain and ravaged his capacity to recognize what he was clutching in his grasp. And that, my friends, has gospel all over it. We have within our hands the gift of God's grace that will counteract all of this mismatching of our words and deeds. I do believe that with the spiritual formation of God in my life, I can be on a journey to be transformed. I arrived at perfection only 10 years ago. I'm deeply sorry that all of you did not fall on the floor laughing, because my wife was the first one to lead the charge. Of course, it is a journey. Of course, I know that and recognize it with my humanity sometimes, but I am on a spiritual transformation process, and I take it incredibly seriously. Christianity can only succeed as a guide for living if it takes the need for human transformation seriously, and it clarifies and exemplifies realistic methods for human transformation. So finally, the devastation of hypocrisy. The devastation of hypocrisy can be seen in the basic meaning of the word hypocrite, which means under a mask. We must come out from behind the mask. When was the last time you were vulnerable with somebody? And then what happened when you were vulnerable? If you were honest and vulnerable with somebody about your need to be better than you are, I would challenge you to say, if you were honest and vulnerable with a Christian, that they could not find a way to forgive you and walk with you through that. One of England's more elite papers is called The Guardian, and it carries a daily confessional column that it calls Corrections and Amplifications. And what's interesting about that is that in that paper, when they started doing that, they thought that it might hurt their image that they, in fact, were going to admit that they had made some mistakes and that they were going to correct them. But what they realized, what the people loved the fact that they admitted that they were wrong. Frederick Dale Bruner observes that Jesus' law is that the way up is down. And what he's saying is that the way up to Christ is always starting with a humble, transparent, real spirit. The Bible says that Jesus learned obedience through the things which he suffered. Hebrews 5:8. You know what the biggest lie that was told right after Jesus died was? This lie that we call docetism, which basically means, it's a big 50-cent word that means that Christ did not really suffer, that he only seemed to be human. He wasn't really human. Why did people want to feel that? Because they didn't want to have to identify with the fact that Christ went through everything that you and I go through. And so that if we can exempt Jesus out, that he really wasn't real, then we never have to be real and honest and growing in our faith experience. So I came up with, or I think I found these, I'm sure, about 4 tests. I've gathered them through the years, but 4 tests about faith at its best. First of all, the first test is the self-test. The self-test. Does your faith give you a greater sense of freedom, self-worth, and self-acceptance than you ever had before? Because if it doesn't, there is something wrong. Now, you can't stay just there. I mean, I know people that love to wallow in the self-test. You know, I just want to feel better about myself. I love to feel good about myself. There's the love test. Does your faith fill you with a sense of love and relationship to the world and to the people around you? Now that's where it gets interesting. Because you can't be going around and not extend your arms. I love you, but I love myself more. I can't, I mean, I love you this much. Can you reach over to me? No, the love test makes you throw your arms open and you can't just, hold on to yourself. It's the love test. Thirdly, it's the tolerance test. Whoa, now it's getting real personal. Does your faith make you more tolerant of the beliefs and the backgrounds and lifestyles of others? Tolerance does not mean I ignore who I am or what I believe. It won't. I have lots of friends who live lifestyles that I, in fact, cannot approve of. And when asked, I tell them why I can't. But it does not change for 1 minute how much I care about them and love them. And that's the honest truth. I mean, I could give you situations, stories of folks in my congregations through the years. They've come to me and said, well, this is my lifestyle. And I've kept a straight face long enough to get through that conversation and then say, well, how can we walk through this together? Because my first question is that where you want to be? My second question is, if that's where you want to be, that's a problem. The tolerance test. And finally, and most importantly, and you'll hear this when you hear the report from the strategic leadership team about this new possible mission statement that we put together. The share test: does your faith impel you to share your life and your property with those who have less than you and to become more involved in making a better world for everyone? Do you know what I encountered this morning? One of our members asked me about a situation they dealt with because they came across a family who had 5 children and they were homeless. Now, I don't know how you handle 5 children and you have them locked in a room. I mean, let alone being homeless. But what I was most impressed was that they said, I have to do something, and they did. Does your faith impel you to share yourself? You know what the lie that we most often hear and believe is that we don't make a difference. And that's the lie that the strategic leadership team is fighting and is going to be fighting as we put together a plan that will, in fact, move us into the future. Is because this little corner here that we have, which is a pretty big corner when you think about it, the influence that we have opportunity to make in our community is far beyond what we even can imagine. Because we believe that every person can and must and will make a difference. Have you heard about this daffodil principle? I'll be honest with you. I heard about it a few years ago and I thought, oh, it's flowers. Come on. I'm not into flowers. Well, I even did the Snopes, on it to see. This probably isn't true. It's probably just a nice little story. Well, the daffodil principle is a true story. If you've not heard about it, it's a daughter phones her mother and goes on she's been trying to get her to go see something. And so it's a 2-hour drive from where they live in Laguna to a place called Lake Arrowhead. She wants her to come and see the daffodils. And of all days, she finally talks her into it, gets her cornered. They're on their way there. It's a really foggy day. But they resist, but they work it out. And there they drive up. And there they see this daffodil garden, handwritten sign on the side of a church. You heard the story? It's a glorious sight. Looks something like that. 5 acres of flowers, daffodils. Small A-frame house is setting off to the side there too, patio of the house. Poster on this sign says, answers to your questions. 3 answers. 50,000 bulbs, one at a time, woman, 2 hands, 2 feet, little brain. Began in 1958. Isn't that something? I don't know if that's the exact picture. I didn't get to go there, but I guarantee you the next time I'm in California, I'm going to grab my brother-in-law and say, let's find this place. The difference that one person can make. I am obsessed with that. I'll just tell you, I'm obsessed with that. Because I have to believe at the end of every day, what I am doing, how I am investing my life makes a kingdom difference. And I have an obsession with that. And what's going to happen in the life of our church when we get that obsession, that everything we do, how we speak, how we live, how we are experiencing God's transformation, when that begins to happen to each of us in small but profound ways, we will begin to impact our community in a way that we've not known probably since the 1950s. And I'm confident that's going to happen. So, what difference does Christ make, and what difference can you make for Christ?